Welcome to this short CAFRE Knowledge Advisory Service webinar looking at fodder issues in light of the dry conditions of the last 2 months. My name is Mark Scott and I'm a Senior Dairying Advisor in the Eastern Region, and today I'm joined by Debbie McConnell from AFBI, Conail Keown, CAFRE Dairying Advisor in Downpatrick, and Michael Verner, CAFRE Dairying Advisor in Newry. Lack of rain in the southeast and mainly County Down since mid-March has had a major impact on soil moisture and consequently grass growth. The impact of this is twofold. Firstly, and the more immediate issue, is that grazing has required additional supplementation with meal or silage in order to maintain milk production and allow adequate regrowth in grazing rotations. Secondly, and the longer term issue, is that silage yields are lower than normal, in addition to the fact that silage stocks are currently being eaten into to sustain milking herds, and this will lead to a fodder shortage on some farms this winter. Debbie, you lead on the grass check project at AFBI. Can you give us an insight into some of the findings from this spring and how they compare to the longer term averages?
Hi Mark. So yes, we're in a very different scenario this year compared to where we were in 2019. Even if we just look back to this week, a year ago, we had growth rates of 90 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day on average in County Down, and good surpluses across the grazing platform. So different scenario. And where we are and the drop in grass production that we've seen in the last month or two has really been driven by the fact that we've had very low rainfall rates. Although our total rainfall for the year is about 420 mils to date, which isn't actually that far behind where we'd expect the long-term average to be. We had a very wet February, and as you can see by the graph on the screen, the blue bars are the total amount of rainfall each week of the year. So we had extremely wet conditions in February, but then since mid-March on, we've had very low levels of rainfall. In fact, actually in April and May itself, we've only had 13 days on average where we have actually had any rainfall. And if you look back in the Met Office records, I think the last time that happened was 1980. So very sort of different conditions to what we would typically expect for this time of year. That has meant that we're about 40% of the total amount of rainfall we'd expect for those 2 months, and that's had a big impact on soil moisture levels. So what you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, as I said, the blue bars are rainfall for each week of the year, but the green line is actually soil moisture or soil dryness, if we like to think about it that way. And that's taken from probes that we have installed on weather stations across grass check farms across the whole of Northern Ireland. And the green line, as I said, is soil moisture, and actually the higher the value here, the drier the soil. So typically what we'd expect to see in winter is soil moisture somewhere between 10 and 20, so fairly wet soils, and you can see that ticking along through January and February, we had quite a lot of soil moisture around. Since then, once we hit March, soil moisture levels started to rise. Now, through an average summer, we would expect that to be in around sort of 30-40 centibars. But this year, as you can see, that lack of rainfall from mid-March onwards has caused soil moisture levels or soil dryness effectively to rise to values over 60 centibars. Now, why that's important is because when we reach that threshold of about 60, grass growth is then restricted because of lack of moisture in the soil. So really from mid-April onwards, we're starting to see that restriction in place. And so that's impacting grass growth. Now, this is the average for Northern Ireland across the 50 grass check weather stations that we have. But actually the average mars, I suppose, the bigger picture, because there is quite a strong east-west divide. It's only in the last sort of few weeks that we've really started to see soil moisture levels creep above 40 and 50 in the west of the province. So actually grass growth there has been very good because soil moisture isn't restricting. But if we look back to sort of middle of April, and in particular at County Down, we have got soil moisture levels readings of over 100 from sort of mid-April onwards, and last week averaging 133 across our County Down farms. So very dry soil conditions in that area. If we look at the next slide, and we can see then the impact that is having on grass production. So the graph that you see on the left-hand side is our typical grass growth curve for Northern Ireland, and that's what we monitor as part of a set of grass check plots at Greenmount and at Hillsborough. And they're managed exactly the same way each year, so the only thing that could influence any differences in grass growth is effectively weather. And those plots managed at Greenmount and Hillsborough really then give us a very good picture of what the long-term grass production is like in Northern Ireland. And the blue dashed line that you can see there in that is our 10-year average growth. So typically what we'd see is grass production peaking in May and then falling down and sort of finishing in mid-October. And that typically produces a yield of about 11.4, 11.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year, reasonably consistently. But what I put on there as well is the 2018 line, where we did have a fairly significant drought in County Down. So you can see we had high production in May there and poor production then as drought hit in June and July, and some recovery in August, but a limited amount. And then the red line, and perhaps the scariest line of all, unfortunately, is the 2020 grass growth production line. And there we can see that this year in May and June time, we're really not hitting the peaks of grass production that we would typically expect at this time of year. And our predicted grass growth rates for the coming weeks, it is expected to fall. So far to date, we're about 1.5 tonne of dry matter per hectare down on where we should be from our plots. And then when we look at the dairy farm data that we're collecting as well across Northern Ireland, again, our dairy farms are down about 0.9 tonne of dry matter per hectare compared to this time last year. But I suppose very similar to the sort of soil moisture story, we are seeing quite big differences in terms of the county averages. And in particular, if we look at County Down, so far farms have produced on average 4 tonne of dry matter per hectare to date, whereas in the west of the province, particularly for Mannan and Tyrone, yielding in excess of 5 and 6 tonne of dry matter per hectare. So we're already seeing quite stark differences there in terms of lost yield in County Down because of the dry weather conditions. And unfortunately, that's set to continue. The last 3 weeks of growth that we've seen, we've got average growth rates for County Down of 43 kilograms of dry matter per hectare compared to sort of mid-70s for the other regions. So unfortunately, that grass reduction, or that reduction in grass growth, is set to continue. And with the dry soils that we have, it will take some time for them to re-wet again to support a lift in grass growth rates.
Okay. Thanks for that, Debbie. So from the grass check data, it's clear to see that there's already a significant deficit that will have left a void in fodder stocks, and this may in turn lead to a winter feed stock issue. Conail, you work with a lot of dairy businesses focused on grazing. What practical things can be implemented for grazing herds to manage grass supply and demand?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. For sure, as Debbie said, we're encountering a dramatic reduction in growth rates. From farms measuring their last week growth rates down into the early teens. That's presenting a real problem, and I suppose it is, what's the best method you can use, or what's the best thing and policy you can implement on your own farm to try and mitigate the problems of a reduced grass supply. So look, it's all about reducing grass demand. Effectively, get rid of the passenger stock in your farm is the first one to look at. Then you can go on further and look at your culling policy in the farm, and how deep do you go into your herd in order to reduce demand significantly. We're talking about really only a growth rate of probably a fifth or a sixth of what it would normally be. So there is a major feed crisis there. For some farms, especially autumn calving farms, you've got the option of drying cows off early, and I think that's a really good option. That means the cows dried off can move to outlying blocks to get feed. But that's not the case for a lot of farms, that especially spring calving farms that are now just at peak milk and right in the middle of breeding. So, it's horses for courses, and it's about getting the right mix for your individual farm. Yes, of course, you can maximize the grass supply available to the cows, and a lot of people have done that already. We've already been there and done that a few weeks ago. Things like bringing in additional area, things like bringing in silage regrowth. But I think now at this stage, first week in June, prolonged dry periods, soil moisture deficit, I think we need to be moving to the next stage So really taking action to reduce that grass demand, and try and hold whatever balance of grass cover you have on your farm. Like the issue I see, and the biggest problem I see in farms is a lot of people are trying to extend the grazing rotation, and pushing it out beyond 25 days, and that in itself is bringing problems. The grass plant is under pressure for moisture. It's not taking up nitrogen. It's automatically going to stem. The longer we leave that grass plant, the more stem there'll be in your grazing sward. So that stem to leaf ratio, which I talk about, isn't really favourable. And pushing the grazing rotation out beyond 25 days isn't really a good idea. It's all about allocating a proportion of your farm and then filling the deficit as best you possibly can. So if you take an example of a 150 cow herd with a 50 hectare grazing block, basically that herd needs to be grazing about 4% of their grazing block daily. So 2 hectares per day. The problem is that a lot of the pre-grazing covers are very low going into now, so it's quite typical for a farm to be going into as low a covers as 2,500 total cover. So it's really only 1,000 kilos of dry matter available. So for 150 cows, 2 hectare grazing block, that's only 2,000 kilos of dry matter available cover. There's an automatically a deficit there. 150 cows mid lactation, the herd demand should be in around 3,100 kilos of dry matter per day. So we have 1,100 kilos of dry matter to make up, which is about 78 kilos per cow of dry matter to make up. And it's about getting that feed in. How do you go about it? Do you feed with powder nut? Do you bring in silage? These are the challenges that are out there now for farms. And in a lot of instances, it's about bringing in more silage, whether that be fed out on the grazing platform, whether that be cows housed at night. What seems to be working quite well in farms is a proportion of the herd housed night and day. That seems to be working quite well. So in a case, for example, that 150 cow herd, is it possible to bring in 50 of the cows or half the herd for night and day full winter ration feeding? And that's a real good idea, I think, in the current situation. Simply because we have to lower our grass demand, and the only way to do that is to remove cows from the grazing block. Increasing the rotation length isn't really a good idea. So that's why I'm saying hold on to your grazing rotation length, and try and allocate that correct amount each day to the cows, and then supplement to fill that deficit. But care has to be taken, especially on the concentrate end of things, because the grass at the minute is sitting. It's not taking up nitrogen, or it's taking up low levels of nitrogen. So therefore, the protein level in the grass is lower than where it should normally be. And also, we've got a lot of herds feeding a lot of supplement feed in terms of silage or palm kernel or soya hulls or beet pulp. These things are lower in protein, and therefore, the parlor feed or the purchased feed going in, I feel should be, should the protein level and that should be increased on a lot of farms. Typically, a lot of grass-based farms will be using like a 16% protein nut going in, but in the situation where cows are housed again, I feel that we need to go back again to maybe an 18% nut or even slightly higher, especially whenever there's more silage in the diet. Zero grazing is another option, but again, care needs to be taken for zero grazing. It's a wee bit similar with a decision to make in terms of grazing silage regrowth. It should really be based on pre-grazing cover. So look, if the grazing covers above, the pre-grazing covers above 3,500, I feel that should continue on its path towards silage and not be grazed or zero grazed. But in the case where it's below 3,500, I feel that zero grazing should be a real option for farms, to bring in that feed from outlying blocks if you can't walk cows to it, and use that to fill that deficit. Anything else there, Mark?
No, thanks, Conail, for that. So that covers the more immediate issue of keeping cows fed and milking the tank at grass. But we sort of need to move now also to think about winter feed. Michael, we experienced similar problems in 2018, and you were involved with many affected herds at that time. What about fodder stocks? What action can farmers take now to ease the impact of the poor growing season on winter feed supplies?
Okay, thanks, Mark. I suppose the big thing is to take action and to take action quickly. 2018, some folks sat back and didn't react fast enough, and then when they did react, they had limited options. So I suppose the first thing I would try and encourage you to do would be to take action now, and I think one of the most important things to do would be to carry out a fodder budget on your farm. What I mean by that is to sit down and work out what silage have I on the farm. You say that's a complicated thing to do. Well, it maybe is, but it's just a simple case of you working out the dimensions of your silo pit, calculating what silage is on it, and then working out what you expect to need this winter. And in fact, if you want, you could even log on to Dairy online services, and there on that site there's a tab called Business Tools, and within it there's a forage stocks application calculator, and that will enable you to calculate not only how much silage you have in hand, but it would also allow you to make an estimate of how much you're likely to need over the coming winter. So that's probably the first thing I would encourage you to do. Secondly, and just as importantly, is to start looking at ways you could fill this dry matter gap with value for money feeds. That's the reality. It's one thing to identify a shortfall, but then you need to try and see, well, how can I fill it? And there are options. There may be farms where you could purchase silage, whether pit silage or standing crops. In all likelihood, there will be whole crop, which will be able to be purchased later on in the summer. There'll be bits and pieces of maize still about. But you've also options of purchasing dry feeds. Conail has already mentioned them. Soya hulls, sugar beet nuts. They could be purchased either to feed in their own right or to put in along with second or third cut silage in the pit. Other things maybe not just as fashionable, but there's been plenty of hay made and perfectly acceptable for feeding to young stock along with concentrates. The big thing is, no matter what you're buying, look at it in terms of value for money, and if at all possible, try and cost it out in terms of pounds per tonne of dry matter, because how do you compare wet silage with dry soya hulls? So try and compare like for like. One other thing is maybe just worth mentioning for most folks, there's still a possibility of trying to squeeze in an extra cut of silage in the back end. You know your own farm better than me, but something to think about. And if we do get a bit of rain and a bit of moisture, as we hope we do, then there's maybe a possibility of you squeezing in an extra cut later on in the season. And remember, if you're going to do that, don't be afraid to sow it accordingly. Conail has already mentioned this point, but passengers, most of us have them, those underperforming cows that maybe are earmarked for culling, get them away. Again, look at your young stock. How many replacement heifers do you really need? You know, what is on the farm? Is there stock that could be moved, which today are maybe grazing grass, which could be shut off and cut for silage? Or maybe in the past or at present, you keep male calves and you graze beef bullocks. Good trade in the markets, maybe they could be moved on in the live ring at present. There's another thing, point number 5 on that slide, it's catch crops. Maybe not suitable for everyone, but they could be used to fill this fodder gap. But again, timeliness would be the key, and it's making a decision and it's sticking with it and it's going ahead, and whether it's sowing Italian ryegrass or Westerwolds later on to try and give you a bit of grazing around the turn of the year. Maybe you're looking at thinking of, could I graze stock on forage brassicas, you know, on dry ground through October, March, or maybe the possibility in your farm of even sowing some of these hybrid kales. And really, they have a very rapid growth, and you could possibly even be grazing those 8 to 10 to 12 weeks after. So folks, there are options with regards winter feed supplies. Work out what you have, work out how they can be stretched, but I think all the options are dependent on action being taken now. And one of the key things is, don't make decisions which will hurt milk yield. Try and maintain milk yield. Try and keep milk on cows. You know what the main drivers are: energy intake and dry matter intake. And Conail's already made the point, if there's large amounts of silage being buffer fed, keep an eye on the protein of the diet, and probably you'll need to lift the protein percentage of the concentrate. And keep an eye on your milk quality. You know, if suddenly there's a big drop in milk protein, well, that's telling you that you're underfeeding. Sometimes we get caught up with body condition score, but the time we see condition coming off cows, it's too late and the harm's been done. So that's some of the things, Mark, maybe we should be trying to do now.
Yeah. What sort of adjustments then, Michael, should farmers make if they find themselves in a fodder shortage situation at the start of the feeding winter and they haven't necessarily taken that action earlier in the year?
Well, Mark, I suppose the key thing in your question is that you asked at the start of the winter. If folks don't make a move at the start of the winter and leave it to January and February, really, that's too late. Because come January and February, you're looking at the back wall of the silo, and any option you make is going to be drastic and it's going to be expensive. So try and make decisions today. And when cows are coming into the house, what can I do? What should I be trying to do? Well, I would suggest, and Conail has mentioned it, I've already mentioned it, but again, at housing time, are there animals which could be culled? Animals which have given problems, poor fertility performance, poor feed, just problem cows. Give them the tail door, move them on, and that will help demand for silage through the winter. Another thing, and I would be keen on this, would be that you would try and target your best silage to either your high yielding group of cows or indeed to your milking cows. Supplementary feeds, alternative feeds, poorer quality silage, yes, that can be fed to young stock on the farm and other groups of animals, but try and keep your best silage to your milking cows. And if possible, if you can sit down and before the winter starts, you know you have a certain tonnage of silage and you have a certain number of cows, you can sort of budget to ensure that the ration's fairly consistent through the winter. The last thing you want to do is to make a major change to a milking cow diet, say, just when you're starting to breed cows. So if you could try and avoid that, hopefully then you'll ensure good milk production through the winter and improved fertility performance. There's one other thing you might wish to consider, and that is, could you move some young stock off your farm this winter? Could you partner with another farm? Could you get someone to perhaps look at rearing your heifers for you, where they would leave your farm and go somewhere else, and they would be fed and managed by another farmer? Possibly an option for this winter. But again, folks, Mark, the key thing I would try to get across is to don't sit in your hands, don't bury your head in the sand, but try and assess the situation and make decisions now, and try, if at all possible, to ensure consistency of diet this winter.
Thank you, Michael. I suppose in summary, it's essential that action is taken sooner rather than later. We've heard that from all our contributors, to ensure a grass shortage now doesn't become a fodder shortage for your herd in the coming winter. Smaller changes made earlier and implemented over a longer period can amount into a substantial saving in the amount of forage required by the herd and maintain your milk output regardless of whether you manage a spring or a winter milk business. Thanks to our contributors today, Debbie McConnell, Michael Verner and Conail Keown, and thank you for watching. If you require any help with planning or implementing any of the points discussed here, please contact your local CAFRE Dairying advisor and keep an eye out on CAFRE's YouTube channel, CAFRE TV, for more topical videos and webinars from our advisors and technologists.